Welcome to the Trauma-Informed Lens podcast. I'm your host, Matt Bennett. Each episode we talk about the research and practical aspects of the trauma-informed movement. This podcast is not designed to replace mental health services. If you feel uncomfortable or triggered by our discussion, please consider seeking your own trauma treatment. In no way is seeking treatment an admission of weakness. It is a chance to build resiliency and experience post-traumatic growth. You can find show notes, resources, and more at traumainformedlens.org. Welcome, friends, to Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I am Matt. I am back here with Charlie Fredrick, second episode, and I have wanted to talk about this subject for a while now. And I was thinking about, well, who could I get to talk about this? And Charlie, first person to pop into my head. We're going to talk about pronouns, sexual identity, things that I say that were okay maybe back, but now seem stupid. So I've given Charlie the ability to correct me, and hopefully we can demonstrate both how to be vulnerable around this, own our mistakes. I will own a lot of my mistakes in my language patterns that need to evolve, and hopefully learn some more as well. So Charlie, please introduce yourself in case people didn't hear your last episode.
Of course. So thank you. My name is Charlie. They, them pronouns are great. I am currently working as the Senior Human Services Coordinator at the Community College of Denver here in Denver, Colorado. And yeah, I'm super stoked for round two. I think it'll be great. I'll just give the caveat that, like, as a non-binary identified person who has a platform right now that's speaking, there's a lot of pressure to speak perfectly, to represent everyone perfectly. And I'm not going to do that. I'm going to speak from my experience. I may say things that people don't agree with, and I support that and welcome that.
Awesome. Well, I'll say stupid things, you say controversial things, and we'll see where this all ends up. So
perfect.
With the pronoun movement, and what I've been gifted with in my life is involvement in the HIV community, which has always, I believe, challenged me to pay extra close attention to language. Also in the trauma world, we know that folks that have been through complex compound trauma also they take on labels that we often put on them of homeless, of addict, of all these things. So language has always been important to me. And I've every year, things I say the previous year, I no longer at least try to say. And so the pronoun movement, and I don't even know if movement's the right word, but this idea of pronouns, I started to see kind of come to the surface in the HIV arena about 10 years ago. And it started out pretty small, and it's kind of eased its way into, at least I would say, the mainstream in the social service arena. But as this has happened, and being 45 is an interesting age with this, because I was raised, and we talked about this at the last podcast, I was raised Indiana, small town. I know we kind of share that small town, Midwestern sort of upbringing where everything was binary. Like, yep. You know, Mr. and Mrs. was what you called almost anybody outside high school, Miss in there as well. And you had to figure out, is this a Mrs. or a Miss? But that was like identity-wise, the challenging piece. Then I got into psychology during a time where the science of psychology, both in undergrad, but then especially in grad school, I was waking up to the fact is we created this whole thing for white, middle class, upper class males. And so during that time, the multiculturalism, and we don't use this term much anymore, but cultural competency, what it was termed at the time, was all about kind of, I think, let's own our past sins and do better moving forward. But with sexuality, both in my upbringing, I shared with you, is there was nobody was out in my high school, and I look at my undergrad, and nobody was, I have to go into my career, to my clients and the staff members that I worked with in my 20s to kind of find that for the first time, which is just like, astounding to think back at it. but even with my training and this focus on multiculturalism, which included sexuality, we tried to put you in a box. There was the lesbian box, there was the gay box, there was the bi box, but nobody really knew what the bi box was all about. Like, it's like, there's bi, and it's like, they can have sex with both people. I mean, it was kind of like, there's and then trans, I'm old enough where it's still hard for me to say this word queer, because it was such a, it was a way to put people down. I played these god awful games in elementary school, in gym class. They use that word that I'm just appalled of. So I if you want to see taking a word back, boy, the queer community has done an amazing job of taking that word back. So I need to be more comfortable, but I was so scared of that word and appalled of my upbringing. So, and then, what first hit me about this fluidity piece, and maybe even that's not the right word, is, learning about, the down low. And boy, did this throw me, Charlie, for a spin. Like, okay, so there's these hetero Black men who have sex with other men. These people, like, you're not even bi, so but what really did was challenge me is, okay, maybe there's a lot of gray in this. There's a lot of this fluidity, and I just, so from my perspective as being like 45, I know my generation, we started to look at this in a very, in some way as a clinical way of how can we be better. The generation older than me, I know I've talked to a lot of people who really struggle. It's like, well, one of my staff members wants to be Z. I'm like, what do I do with that? What is that? And I'm like, all right, let me Google it real quick. And it's like, well, if they want to be this, we should respect that. But so there's like, I think there's still that angst of, okay, if you identify as they, what does that mean? And I think for a lot of us, using that pronoun is something we've got to practice a lot, because it doesn't come natural, just because it's a change, which doesn't mean we shouldn't practice it a lot. So there's this idea, and especially in the helping community, that as part of the trauma-informed journey, we want to be there, but again, it's such a different way than a lot of us were raised. And with that said, I'd love to kind of hear just your experience as the younger one here. What was it like for you with this? I gave the old guy experience, so I'd love to hear yours, and just kind of how maybe your thinking's evolved or started out just way ahead of where I maybe even am today.
Well, you definitely gave me a few things to chew on.
And I've given Charlie permission to correct any of my language throughout the podcast. So I'm hoping to learn from you as well, my friend.
Yeah, so as the resident young 37-year-old, I can leagues apart with the generation gap there. But yeah, I mean, so some of the things, I'm taking some notes while you were talking, and some of the things that, that come up as a, non-binary identified person for me is a few things I just kind of want to lift up is pronouns are not new. Pronouns have been part of the English language for a very, 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 very long time, yeah. Right? And so I agree with you that it's become more of like a social justice-y kind of buzz narrative in the last 10 plus years. But using pronouns is not a new thing. We use pronouns every single day.
Yes, yeah.
The other thing I kind of want to just name and lift up is I think that there's some blurring between sexuality and gender identity that are not the same thing. Mm-hmm. So just to kind of put that out there, and I think that's a big part of why a lot of folks who are like lumped into like the T category of LGBT have a lot of complicated feelings and contradictory feelings about being part of the community, because being trans is not the same as being gay, right? You can be both, but it's not always a both and. Right. And so that's, I think, a complication I just want to kind of lift up. And then in terms of, I agree that the narrative is that, using they, them pronouns, for example, is unnatural or like is not how we were taught. But if we actually look at how grammar is structured, which I know in the United States, grammar skills is not generally our population strong suit, but the they, them pronouns actually have been used historically for a very long time also, right? Yeah. And so from a like, from a part of speech, I just like, it's not a new thing to use subjective, objective pronouns such as they and them. I think what's challenging is that cis folks or non-trans folks get very hung up on it because they want to continue to prescribe specific pronouns based on people's presentation. And that is just like a practice of assumptions that I think that's the biggest part of this newer movement that you're talking about. That's really pushing back against. It's not about reformatting the English language. It's not about, you know, challenging people to like structure things that are unnatural. It's more about challenging people to stop making assumptions.
Mm-hmm. So when you say, because I love that, there's so much wisdom in that statement. You know, because again, being the old guy, you know, we used to, you know, and when you get the APA style forced upon you in undergrad and graduate, all of a sudden grammar becomes it's like you used to, and I was at it's like he was everything. Like then it was, oh, we better throw she in there, and now they. So we've evolved in this, and you know, is that one of the things that I find, you know, is like, again, being raised the way I am, sir and ma'am was a sign of, and I use this a lot in my training until I was like, this does not work anymore. This does, you know, and so friends is kind of the place. But when you talk about the assumption piece of this, is they, if I don't know your pronoun, is they you know, is sort of, should that be our default, so to speak?
Yeah, I think if we get anything from this hour conversation, it's that there isn't a universal rule.
Come on, Charlie, come on. Help me out. Give me, help me here.
I will say from my own personal experience, right? I like that, and I like defaulting to non-gendered language until someone asks you to be specific about their pronouns and their gender. I personally like that, right? And I think that is true for me because as someone who is like normatively masculine presenting, let's say, and I don't use he, him pronouns, I would just prefer that people just default to gender neutral because then I wouldn't be misgendered every 30 seconds. Right. That said, for folks who are more identified as like a binary trans person, who are really trying to just like live their truth and pass, right? Not everyone wants to constantly be asked their pronouns. They actually want you just to assume that like, if I'm presenting female, like I want you to use she, her pronouns, right? So there isn't a universal best practices, but I think that you're going to offend less people if you don't immediately gender them.
Yeah, because that's been early on there was a struggle, and it's less of a struggle now because most of my groups that I train are progressive on this issue, but there was like, you know, when if you know, we had a smaller group to go around the room and have everybody introduce yourself, I really, in some ways, you know, and I'll own probably some of my own, but like one of the things I want to do really early on in this is, oh, and what are your pronouns? One, I needed to spend probably 5 to 10 minutes educating a group that may not have all heard of this. But the other thing is like, I had that, you know, kind of hesitation is, am I asking somebody either to maybe out themselves to their coworkers in a way that they haven't, or because they haven't kind of put out a pronoun that they don't really identify with just because they don't want to have that conversation because a stupid trainer kind of had them do this. And I you know, I don't know, like I really have written that off to my own uncomfortableness with trying to create a safe environment. But it was a really early on, it was like that back and forth of, I didn't want to have people put themselves in boxes. So if you were doing like a training for a group now, would you use the pronouns as part of the introduction, in light of what you just brought out?
Yeah, so again, I'm just going to use my own experience because everyone feels differently about the like pronoun go around question, right? Because I have been in so many meetings where like it would just be faster if I raised my hand and I was like, I'm the non-binary person in the room, let's move on.
Yeah.
It would just be so much faster.
Yeah.
And there is that risk of outing a person or feeling like you're forcing them to out themselves to a group of people who they're not ready to.
Yeah.
And again, from my own personal experience, I will just say that I will protect myself. And so if I feel like I'm in a space where like it's a safer space that like I feel okay about having my pronouns out there and my gender identity being visible, I will do that. And if I don't feel safe in those spaces, I won't do that. Right.
Yeah.
And I will name that part of that is a privilege that I have that I can hide behind this presentation and people can misgender me all day long. And I will feel that emotionally, but nobody else will know that. Not every non-binary, not every trans person has that privilege. Right. And just by going outside of their house, they're outed. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so for those reasons, both the self-preservation reason and not everyone gets to be able to do the self-preservation, like hiding work. I always default to asking people like, if you feel comfortable, let's go around and, say name and pronouns. And I maybe will do like a 30-second kind of plug. As a reminder, pronouns include things like he, she, him, her, right? Because again, the United States is not known for our like English understandings. So I'm always dumbfounded by the number of people who don't know what pronouns are. And I often just wonder what they think that they are. But yeah, so I always invite it. And it's rather than a command. So I always like, if folks feel comfortable, it'd be great to share your name and your pronoun. And then people know that they have permission to do what they want.
Yeah. Yeah, it's this, and I don't want to get too stuck on this because as a trainer, you work in a different realm than at a lot of times, but I could see this in a meeting as well. It's like, if you've not had this conversation with your coworkers, is a large group introduction the time to say, yeah, my pronouns they, when now your coworkers are like, oh no, I've been using, and so it's like this, it's one of those things that I think I imagine, it's so different than it was 10 years ago when there was maybe just a few of us in the room where this was really a conscious thing that we were struggling with. Now it's about 5 years from now. It may, if you're a nonprofit helping organization that hasn't had this conversation, you're going to be that outlier piece. But it is that sort of, where do you create as psychological safety in a way that respects where everybody is at? And again, a trainer, there's sort of this different intensity to some of that. Is I may offend people if I don't say and provide your pronouns, but again, it's just like, okay, that struggle for psychological safety and respect and dignity is, there wasn't a kind of a all or nothing binary sort of this or that's the right way to do it moving forward.
Yeah, I think again, the kind of like the take home lesson about non-binary identities, right, is that the binary is broken, right? That there isn't actually a binary and that's not actually a useful framing. And so like for me, like again, I like just normalizing, not making assumptions. And so like the move in, particularly nonprofit world, but also higher education, some other places, to include pronouns in your email signature, right? Is just really great because I can't tell you the number of times that I eye roll during the day when someone's like, Mr. Fredrick, thank you so much for your email, even though my pronouns are literally right after my name in every signature line of every email I ever send.
Yeah. So preparing for this, because again, this is something that I try. So the Mr., Mrs., Miss, should we just in your opinion, get rid? I mean, because I was like just trying to think like, okay, if I were to say use a formal salutation for Charlie, what would I put? And I guess I didn't come up with a good answer, and I was a little appalled that I didn't have a good answer. And I was like, well, Charlie's going to be on the podcast. I can't be the only one that has this question. So I don't want, again, this to be educate the dumb white cisgender straight guy, but like
that's what we're here for, my friend.
yeah,
It's
exactly.
okay.
so if I were to write to a formal letter, so to speak, well, is there a better way to do that?
Well, yeah, I mean, so that brings up a lot of things, right? Because part of it is about power, right?
Yeah.
And so why does it matter, formalities or not, right? That's one question I would always frame.
Yeah.
But the benefit of being human and having language is that we can change language whenever we want to, right?
Yeah.
And so you brought up like Mr., Miss, Mr., Mrs., and Ms., right? MS is like a 50-year-old term, right? Like that's not an old term, right? And it came about from
that's still being done in my wife's elementary school, by the way. Like so yes, and it's still, I think, being very much ingrained when they call my wife Mrs. Bennett. So yeah.
Yep. So I mean, from that perspective, there are a lot of proposals on the table for non-gender specific honorifics, right? And so the one that I really enjoy is MX. So just taking the like gendered part of the language out and adding an X instead. And so you see that in a lot of things like Latinx community as opposed to Latino community, right? And so I personally like that, and you just would pronounce that mix as in like you're mixing something, right? But some people prefer just the letter M and pronounce it like the letter M, and then just not having a mer or a miss afterwards.
Interesting.
Right? And so I think, again, the lesson there is exactly what you're saying. Like, well, what happens if I don't know? And it's like, well, what happens when you don't know something else? You ask.
Right. Yeah. And I like I said, a great reminder because, and how much do we write formal, but I think back of, it is like, what's ingrained in you is you look at the name and you put the Mr., Mrs., on there, and, to break out some of those patterns. And again, why the formalities? Like I remember master used to be which seemed really inappropriate, even back when I was like 4 years old. I'm like, what, master of what?
But I also think about just like, how we as a society gender words, right? Like, why is Matt a masculine name?
Right.
Because we said so, right?
Yes.
But it doesn't mean that it has to be.
Nah.
Right.
Exactly. So when for the audience who might be a little newer to this conversation, we've thrown the word non-binary around quite a bit. Could you just a little bit expand on that? Because I'm not sure everybody has and it's probably wide spanning as everything else we're talking about. But what if you were to give a definition of non-binary? What would that entail, just for folks that might not be as familiar with that word?
Totally. I'm going to try not to do like super deep dive like gender studies. So this isn't going to be like a Judith Butler lesson, but maybe like a few steps down. But so if you understand like the basic normative assumptions about gender, that you have male and female, right? That literally is a binary between those two. And so non-binary, if you're staying in that kind of framework, would be in the middle, right? Of like, I don't really identify with one or the other, right? Yeah. But part of the non-binary project, if you will, right, is to also question that line entirely, right? Yeah. And so you'll see a jillion different gender identities, right? Like gray gender, agender, like all these different things, right, that are actually not related to the line between male and female, right? And so there's a lot of other people in the community who are proactively just being like, let's just get rid of the binary line entirely.
Okay. Which is that's an important, I think, distinction, because, the line that I was taught about back in all those multicultural classes was like, kind of straight gay, like, and again, I think back at the time, it's like, well, and there's also bi, and it's like, it's like, we don't know, like, those people exist somewhere in between there, but we all exist somewhere on that scale. And I think that along with the, Mr., Mrs., boy, girl, also is being, really challenged and expanded on. And I think ways that reflect people's experience in a much, much better way. I think we were just trying to put people in boxes so we could probably do it. I mean, and I think the intention was, if we put them in a box, we can understand where we failed the box, what we can do better with the box. We can study the box. We can do peer review journals on the box. But again, it was in hindsight, a very limiting thing with our language, I believe, to do.
Well, I mean, so a couple pieces again. So one, as primates, which I know people don't like to think that we're animals, but we are. We're symbolic creatures, right? And so putting things in categories is how we like evolve, throughout time. So like, it's not that putting things in categories is necessarily wrong, right? But just like when we talk about trauma, it's like you have adaptive strategies that are not wrong, but they might not also be serving you right now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's just one invitation. And then the other is, again, just continuing to parse out and separate gender binary from sexual orientation binary.
Talk about that. Yeah.
So, you had mentioned, gay, straight, and then bi is somewhere, right? It's an analogous binary, but they're different. They're not the same binaries. Mm-hmm. And so whenever I talk about, for the sexuality binary, I think people really like Kinsey and the Kinsey scale of like, I'm a level 5 gay or whatever, right? Which, sure, if that works for you, that's great.
Yeah.
And frankly, I like, because I moved to Colorado 2.5 years ago now. And I will say, as someone coming from San Francisco, I'm one of those people, I apologize to your listeners. I was really actually taken aback by how many people proactively outwardly identify as bi here. And it was actually really refreshing, right, from a sexuality perspective, and particularly for cisgendered men who identify as bisexual. I have seen more of that in Colorado than I ever saw in San Francisco.
Huh.
And so it's actually this really kind of like interesting little nugget about Colorado that I did not know until I moved here, right? Which is kind of exciting. But then, from a gender binary, one of the ways I try to help people understand the gender binary of like, if you have masculine on one side, feminine on the other side, right? Like, no one is like 100% one or the other, right? And like social factors impact that all the time. So you and I both grew up in small rural Midwest America, right? Women in those small towns who are women, they don't identify as men, they don't have any, also are not what you would consider feminine if you went to New York, right?
Yeah.
They're mostly wearing jeans, they're mostly wearing like whatever else, right? That's not a feminine, quote unquote, look if you're in an urban environment, right? And so there's always this fluidity of like how we are being read based on like either how we're presenting or where we grew up, right? That like moves us across that spectrum of like masculine versus feminine, right? And I think part of the non-binary, again, non-binary project, non-binary movement, whatever you want to call it, we're just really trying to call attention to that and actually name that, like, I don't prescribe to this narrative of like, I have to be one or the other. And I'm going to actually like constitute for myself how I identify. And I'm going to ask for you to meet me where I'm at.
Yeah. Great. Is there, I mean, one of the thoughts that come up about this, and I think this comes from kind of the Mr. Mrs. conversation is, is they just a better pronoun? Like, I mean, should I mean, as somebody who, I mean, I'm cisgender, straight, white, male. I mean, I'm all that, but it just seems like such a better way, but at the same time, I, don't want to disrespect, is there any stepping on toes if we start to kind of use that more open, fluid language, maybe, because like I said, I don't want to prejudge somebody, which if I do he, she, I'm prejudging them. If, but I also don't want to say I'm a they, Am I making sense? Like, it just seems like there's a better, maybe general way to do this, but if I kind of run that thinking, are we minimizing in some ways this identity that people fought really hard to say, hey, we exist over here, so he, him, his, stay in your box, if I'm making any sense whatsoever here. They sounds like a better starting place.
No, you're good. So
okay,
here's what I'm gonna say. If it was me, if I was in a group of people, I would default to gender neutral pronouns because I don't know everyone, right? Okay. If I'm in a one-on-one conversation or a smaller group, it's just easier to be like, hey, my name's Charlie. I use they, them pronouns. What about you?
Yeah.
Right. And just ask. Yeah. Some people may get offended that you're asking. Some people may be confused because they don't know what a pronoun is, but like, just normalize the fact that I'm not going to assume your gender identity. Right. The other piece that I want to name that you brought up for me is like the I'm a they, right? Mm-hmm. So to me, that is a confusion of subjective and objective uses of the pronoun, right? So yeah. if you're thinking about like as a grammatical example, right? Like the teacher caught they passing notes. That's not how you use that word, right? You would say the teacher caught them passing notes. Right. Okay. So that's still not gender specific, right? So that's still respecting a non-binary they, them pronoun framework, but it's still grammatically correct. And so that's why whenever people are always like, oh, the grammar, it's so hard to relearn. It's like it's actually like, if you literally followed English structure correctly, yeah. it is the correct use of the word them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And so it's like, just like every other pronoun, right? It's literally just a noun that can replace a different noun. So rather than saying like, Sarah did this, and then Sarah did that, and then Sarah did this other thing, right? It's like Sarah did this, she went there, and then they did this, right? Okay. Yeah. And so it's more, again, knowing English structure and the objective and subjective use of pronouns. Because you wouldn't say like, please mail it to I, right? You would say, please mail it to me.
Yeah. And I think that and this is just a grammatical thing, and boy, am I not one to speak about grammar, but part of the confusion is they pass the letter. I'm thinking about multiple people. I think, yeah, maybe that's some of the, like, when you go plural, but you're speaking of a singular, I think that throws some people off, but that's something we can,
I find it so fascinating because you do it every day when it's not explicitly about trans people. You do it all the time.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Like if I called your office and I was like, hey, is Matt there? The front desk person could say, oh, he's not here today.
Yeah.
They could also say they are not here today.
Yeah. Yeah. And
right?
It would be you're right. Yeah.
No one would think twice about that.
Yeah.
But if you put it in the context of gender identity, cis people lose their minds.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like, and I find that true because, really paying attention to this, and, when you write a book, it's out there in the world. And I imagine if you look at the book I published in 2017 versus the one I published this year, you'd probably see a little bit of evolution here. Hopefully not a problem with the 2017, but it's just that it does work really well. But and this is what I find too, and I'll just own this, and I shared the little bits with you. On the written page, for me, it becomes pretty easy. One is because spell check will sometimes still say, hey, you did this wrong. And I'm like, nope, I did it okay. Which is a whole nother thing. But it's like, what I just am working so hard to get out of my vocabulary. And I know even the training where we met each other, I screwed up a few times with this, is like, hey guys, let's all come back. Like, and then I like get horrified, and then gals, and then folks, and then I'm just throwing out all these where it's just like these things come from like a place inside of me that I don't want to exist anymore. But so when someone screws this up, what is like, because I think there's a lot of well-meaning people, and I hope I'm a well-meaning person that will throw, and it can be an all group of there's nobody representing as a he, him, his, and I'll use guys to, and obviously something I'm working on. But if I make the mistake, instead of just verbally vomiting a whole lot of other things, is there a way respectively to call yourself on this? Because I find, while I've started businesses with people, one of my business partners, lesbian. I mean, I've been in businesses I've started are mostly non-hetero, in that, and but I still find I slip up with the they pronoun. I know on the podcast I slipped up with you on the they pronoun. Is there a way to, I don't know, gently? Should we just apologize to say, I want to say that over again. I'm working on this. Do you have any like ways that, if we screw up as we are working to make this our new way of talking, knowing that people like me come from a good intention, know better, but still the stupidness comes out of my mouth at times. Is there a way we could self-correct that is somewhat respectful? I mean,
this is why I'm on podcast number 2, right? Because I enjoy these conversations, yes. Matt. And it's also because you, like, in your question, you like ask so many questions. Like, I just always have things to talk about, which is great.
Yes.
So one of the things I want to name is, like, you kind of mentioned that it's like a thing that just comes from inside you, and that's not true, right? It actually comes from our culture, which is deeply rooted in patriarchy and sexism, right? So the reason why it sounds fine to say, hey, you guys, instead of hey, you girls, is because men are offended by getting called girl, where women are expected to not be. Right? So that's not you, right? That's our culture, and that you then internalized, right?
Yes.
So when I think about all this, you can't stop thinking about power.
Yeah.
So that's one piece. But to your actual essence of your question,
if I can just stop, I mean, that's a powerful piece of feedback for me, because I like, I catch my words, like, and then it's just like, guys, gals, folks, friends, like, and then I just like this verbal vomit. But it is my involvement in the patriarchy where that language come from. And in fact, I think that's why I get so appalled right afterwards. But it's just like, that's a really good check for me. So I just wanted to say thank you for that, because
for sure. I mean, I would be remiss to not, be explicit in the fact that, queer/trans, studies and culture and movement is deeply benefited from and rooted in feminism, right? Oh, and a lot of cis gay men would like to pretend like it isn't, right? But we really owe our movement, our lives, our conversation today to feminist struggle, right? And so you have to name the patriarchy and gender oppression to be able to have these kinds of conversations.
And just looking back, like how and I'm not taking this as an excuse forward, because, like I said, I'm working, and it's weird because Zoom makes it harder for some reason. Like if I see everybody, I'm like, okay, guys is not an appropriate word to label this beautiful, diverse group. It's just something like, I gotta work on this. And part of it's probably being less caffeinated and slowing down a little bit of my language. I can know my own weaknesses where this comes from. But when I look back, it's just like, wow, this was so indoctrinated in education, in our language. And it's this conversation is great because, again, that Mr. Mrs. piece of this is we're carrying this forward, even that we represent like an unmarried woman versus a married woman, and we still use some of that. And I know there's been that even is somewhat outdated in the formal language, but it's just like, when you take a step back, and I think, for us that grew up in this and carry some of this, it's just what, you're right. It doesn't come from within, but it's kind of hardwired that we need to change the hardwiring that we've been, that comes out of our mouth. It's just being open to look at that and to call it what it is, because I think it's like, oh, Matt's just thrown out verbal vomit again. It's if I thought I was using an offensive term, which I am, which is why the verbal, but it's like, okay, this is on the level of some other offensive words that I've eliminated from my vocabulary and never will say again. And I really need to take it that seriously as well.
Yeah, I mean, despite what our current president says, like, we have systems of oppression deeply rooted in our culture.
Yeah. Yes.
Sorry, not sorry. And the other thing that I will say, just because you and I obviously did not grow up together, but we grew up in a very similar kind of like culture, if you will, right? In addition to like ingrained patriarchy, we also, from like a white rural background, have like this deep like white respectability politics where if we ever offend anyone, we like almost like break our neck trying to like grovel and make up for it to prove that we're not the devil, right? And that is just like some Puritan like background kind of nonsense that just like is not helpful, right? Like it comes from a good place, like I get it, right? But like it's just not helpful, right? Because what that ultimately is, it's performative, A, and B, it's mostly about you, not the person that you actually offended.
Absolutely. Right? Yeah. Because and I think most of my audience is just maybe, but it's like, it is about me. That like, and it is about being, like I said, being a trainer puts some of this in a very different perspective, because obviously it's not good anywhere, but if you're probably at a bank, probably folks may not be having they need to have these kind of conversations, but it's like, okay, I'm supposed to be giving you the best of what you could get on this, and like trauma informed, where I'm throwing out the patriarchy with labeling y'all guys, or doing that, and again, what I could say 15 years ago, not that I was trying to get away with anything, but just this shift. And I think this is where a lot of people have gotten a little bit disoriented with it, is like, I'm right now, like, I've been using LGBTQ plus, and I'm kind of thinking that's not right. I heard AI, LGBTQAI. So I go to any workshop I can, because I'm always hesitant. I'm always afraid, as again, cisgender, straight male, white male, that I'm it's my job to have the vocabulary right. But for folks that I think they feel they get lost in that rapidly changing language, which again, I think is showing progress at a very level. But I think unfortunately, too many people also give up of like, oh, there's going to add another letter to the end of it eventually anyway. But it's like, nope, you need to keep learning and listening, and what's this mean? And
I mean, I think some of the things I'll say again from that bucket of nuggets, is, again, if to be an ally, whether that's gender ally, race ally, class ally, whatever, right? If you like quote unquote mess up, and then like the next like series of like word vomits are all I statements, it's actually about you, not the person that you offended, right? So I would just challenge and invite you, if like that is like the like natural inclination that you have like kind of grown up with and internalized, to challenge it, right? Because again, if the genuine concern is that you hurt someone else's feelings, a bunch of I statements is still not about them.
Exactly.
The other piece I'll say is, and I do want to get to the like, if I mess up with pronouns, what do I do? Which is your original question. but I want to name the
verbal vomits. Yes. Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast.
I want to name like what what I as part of the community jokingly call the like queer alphabet soup.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? Because it is like a million different letters, right? And all those letters are valid, and they're always changing, and people identify with them differently, right? And so like, are you ever gonna always have like the most woke, best, like whatever? Probably not. And that's okay, right? Like, and if you leave a letter out that like means something to someone's personal identity that is important to them, you can say, I'm sorry, and add it in. Right? It's not that hard, right? Because yes, you do have like the Q, the I, the double S, you have the like all kinds of things, right? I sometimes, if I'm talking, because if I write it out, I can write out a longer kind of like, combination of abbreviations. But if I'm writing, LGBTQ plus is easier to say than if I was writing something, right? For me, that does not mean that I'm trying to leave out like my two spirit sisters and brothers. It doesn't mean that I'm trying to like, right? It doesn't mean that I'm leaving out my questioning folks. It doesn't mean that I'm leaving out my intersex folks. It's just like fast, like shorthand, right? That said, if someone calls me on it, is like, hey, like you left this out and that's important to me, I can just say, I'm sorry, and then reframe it.
Great.
Right. And again, that's a similar way that I, as someone who's misgendered at least 100 times a day, I appreciate, because what is challenging about apologies that are performative and more about the person, not the one being harmed, is that there's an expectation of care that the harmed person is supposed to then provide to the person who did the harm, right?
Yeah.
And I don't have energy for that shit.
No,
I just don't, right?
No.
And so like I've been in spaces where someone has like like in a public meeting, like out, someone misgenders me, and then for the next 10 minutes, I have to like listen to like their litany of like why it happened and like how they're working really hard on it. And like, I just like, I don't have energy for it. Like, yeah, you hurt my feelings. Yes. Like I've told you 10,000 times what my pronouns are and you still don't get it right.
Yeah.
And I don't want to listen to a 20-minute like monologue about why. Right. So if you mess someone's pronouns up, you were like, oh yeah, they, them, sorry, thanks for that. And then move on. It's like, it sucks that you messed up, especially if they already told you ahead of time. And like, we're not perfect and people mess up. I mess up all the time as a non-binary person. I mess up with those pronouns. And I say, yep, you're right. She, her, thanks, and move on.
Yeah, great point. So a question that I had, and this came from an example I used in my trainings, and I've given this example to probably 10,000 people. And I got some feedback on it. So 1 in 10,000, but I really, I wanted to really pay attention to this piece of feedback. And it's been one that I've been in some ways obsessing about ever since I got it. And it was some, I use an example, and I don't need to get too far into the example, but I talk about oxytocin and the role oxytocin plays in trust. And I have this whole kind of stick, so to speak, about when oxytocin floods our body, and it's birth and breastfeeding. And I go in this whole thing about how, mom gives birth, and I have a whole joke about I never understood the second baby, but now that I know you're stoned off oxytocin, maybe the second one doesn't sound so bad because I've seen the video. I've got this whole stick, but I use the term mother, and I got some real honest feedback on my use of that word. And so I just, I wonder from this pronoun conversation we are having, I guess I hadn't thought about that from that biological, I don't even know, maybe societal construct of a role of mother. And so when we look at these traditional roles, and I know mother, father, but if it was a lesbian couple, mother would be an easy one to use. But, when we look at these in a deeper way, because again, the pronoun things give us some things, but, this just woke me up to saying, ooh, this actually goes deeper. And then I kind of thought about my language, and I didn't have necessarily a good replacement in my vocabulary, at least, for the term of the person giving birth and then breastfeeding. And I just kind of wonder, because I've been obsessing about this, and okay, when I'm up in front of a group of people again, is there a better way to approach this?
Can I interrupt you?
Yes, please.
You just answered your own question. You just said the person giving birth. Right. So this is maybe like the gender question, like 2.0, which some people may drop out on, but there's a lot of concern, particularly again, radical feminist movements, right? And left feminist movements, that trans and non-binary identities and movements are erasing their womanhood and their identity, right? Yeah. And so what I want to just name and push back on is while some of the systems, particularly medical systems that are explicitly needing to be as inclusive as possible, may move to and are moving to, frankly, things like people who give birth, people who have abortions, people who menstruate, right? That does not mean that you cannot identify as a mother, that you cannot be a woman who menstruates, right? It just means that on a generic website, when we're trying to include as many people as possible who may need that service, we're going to say people who do X, people who have X, right? Because if we understand that trans men are men who have the ability to get pregnant and have children, right? Calling them mothers is generally not appropriate, right? And so having it framed as people who give birth on a website in a large training where we don't know who the audience all is as inclusive as we can be. And we are not saying that any one individual person can't identify as a mother, as a whatever.
Great.
Right?
Awesome. I appreciate, because you're right. I did. And that's where I was going with it. But again, it's like, and you're right. In the medical arena, it is language being used more. But it was really interesting to get that specific about almost an event that happens and taking that out of that. Because, your answer to, the other struggle, and this goes out, well, I guess this does in many ways, connect to our pronouns, like the Latinx use, because what I've struggled with that, I haven't struggled with Latinx, I actually really like that, but then listening to people from that community who dislike that.
There's so much drama.
And so I like, and it doesn't roll off the tongue, but Latino, Latina, Latinx, again, it'd be great if it was simpler, or people from Latin America, or that but it's an interesting where, I'm keeping an eye on that sort of what that community is doing with language, because like I said, it's like, okay, I'm going to just give everybody everything. And, with that, but it's interesting, especially with the language, the Spanish language, and I learned French for 2 awful years in high school, where everything was identified kind of as masculine or feminine. And I think that controversy kind of like this is interesting. And as, the white trainer trying to respect everybody's opinion.
Well, that's where I like, where when people in English speaking countries like have like meltdowns over they them pronouns or gender neutral pronouns, I have to laugh, because English isn't a gendered language.
No, it's not. Yes.
And so if people in Spanish speaking countries can figure out how to like not make everything gendered to be inclusive, people who already don't have gendered language are okay, right? Yes. And so there is, I don't want to touch a ton on the controversies within the Latinx versus Latino versus Latina, and including the Chicano, Chicanx, right? Because I'm not those identities, and I don't want to speak for that community. I'm not a part of it. But there's a lot of stuff there that includes all some things that we've been talking about, right? Around patriarchy, around sexism, right? And around change, right? But then particularly when you mix between Chicanx, Latinx, and then Hispanic, right? That just creates that brings up a whole series of culture and political pieces, right? And I think it all has gotten really muddied in that. And I would invite you to bring some people on from those cult communities to like have those conversations. But yeah, we don't like in the English speaking world, like we have nothing to complain about in terms of using gender neutral identifiers.
I think that's actually a really good point to wrap up with, is that we don't. And like I said, it's like the writing, it's become like second nature. And it's the speaking where, what I've really done is just, how do I practice this? How do I get this in? And then realizing that, boy, I'm reverting to, 8th grade Matt when I'm on a Zoom call. Why the heck does the patriarchy come out on Zoom? And part of it is I'm just looking at a lot of people's names or nobody's names when I'm talking to a screen. And it's like, okay, I got some work to do on myself in my preparation. I practice how to talk about the brain. I need to practice that as well. So I wanted to give, because you really ended on a great note there, any final words, because I don't shut up, but anything that you would like to communicate that we haven't talked about yet before we wrap up?
No, I mean, like, I encourage people to practice, because you already practice all the time, and just mostly practice not making assumptions, right? Yes. Like, he went to the store, the apple is theirs, right? Like, you can switch back and forth very easily, and it's not that hard. So I would just invite folks to like whatever energy that you're holding on to around it, just like let it go,
Yes.
and just actually speak like you normally would if you weren't hyper vigilant about gender.
Yes.
Right. There are also a jillion resources out there. So it was just International Pronouns Day. I think it was like last week, right?
Yes.
That website has like a million different resources, including grammar graphs for the grammar and challenged folks in the audience, right? That can literally talk about the subjective, objective, possessive, and reflexive versions of pronouns.
Yeah.
With examples.
Yes. And if you don't remember what any of that is, go to their website, and as I had to do, and like, yeah. Because some of that stuff,
like it's all gonna be okay. That's that's how I end it. It's like it's gonna be okay.
Yes. And I'll end on it. If you screw up, don't make it about you.
Yep. Indeed.
Awesome. Well, Charlie, thank you so much. When I was thinking about somebody I wanted to talk to about this, you were the first one that popped into my head. So thank you so very much. I'll put a little bit of information, Charlie, up on traumainformedlens.org with the show notes. And I'm just going to need to brainstorm another topic to get you back, because I love sharing your wisdom with the audience. And something that we probably should be talking about, like our last episode, how do we have these really genuine conversations within our organizations? And I think you've really helped us mirror this with your patience with me throughout this conversation. So
I had a really great time. I always enjoy talking to you. So I just appreciate the invite. It's really been good to be here.
Thank you so much, my friend. Everybody, again, traumainformedlens.org, and we'll see you next week. Of course.